After 50 years of marriage, the husband leaves his wife for a 20-year-old woman. What his ex-wife did to him is truly heartbreaking. But before that, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing amazing stories. Charles and Grace had been married for 50 years and were considered the epitome of true love. Their relationship had matured over the years, reaching an impressive depth and stability. Together, they had built a life filled with shared experiences and mutual respect. Charles, a tall, robust man with snow-white hair and a perpetually friendly smile, had spent his entire life working as a teacher. Known for his patience and understanding both at home and at school, he had a passion for history that he passed on to countless students. Many of these students would often visit him to reminisce about the lessons and stories he had shared with them. Grace, a petite woman with sparkling blue eyes and an indomitable spirit, was a gifted pianist. Her life was devoted to music, and she had showcased her talents in numerous concerts and performances. Alongside her career, she always embraced the roles of a loving mother and grandmother, roles that her family deeply appreciated. They had met in their youth, when Charles had just finished his teaching degree, and Grace, a young music student, was giving her first concert. Their meeting was like a fairy tale. Charles was immediately captivated by Grace's grace and talent, while Grace was drawn to Charles's knowledge and calm, soothing demeanor. They began a romance that quickly blossomed into a deep and solid bond. Over the years, they had faced many challenges together. Whether it was building their own house in a small village on the outskirts of Boston or raising their 3 children, Charles and Grace always stood by each other. Their love was strong and unwavering, a light that shone even in the darkest times. Their golden anniversary was celebrated by their family and friends. Children and grandchildren gathered to honor the extraordinary bond that Charles and Grace shared. On that day, they reflected on the past, shared stories, and recalled the many happy moments they had experienced together. Despite the outward happiness, something began to change. A subtle restlessness crept into Charles's behavior, a change that Grace initially couldn't place. But on that day, as they looked back on their golden anniversary, the world seemed in order, and they loved each other as much as ever. Thus, after 50 years, Charles and Grace still stood side by side, an example of the kind of love that even time could not separate. Charles and Grace lived a life full of happy moments, characterized by mutual support and a deep connection. Every morning began with a loving ritual. Charles made the coffee while Grace set the breakfast table. They enjoyed sitting together in their cozy dining room, discussing the plans for the day ahead. Their days were filled with a pleasant routine. Charles, now retired, often spent his time in the garden, tenderly caring for the flowers and tending to the vegetable patch. Grace, still passionately playing the piano, used this time to practice new pieces or compose in her music room. The sounds of her piano filled the house with a harmonious atmosphere that Charles particularly loved. Daily walks through the nearby forest were a regular part of their routine. Hand in hand, they wandered the paths, chatting about everything and enjoying the beauty of nature. These moments of togetherness strengthened their bond and allowed them to rediscover the joy they found in each other. Evenings, when twilight fell, they gathered in the living room. Grace often played gentle melodies on the piano, while Charles read a book or browsed through old photo albums. The memories of past times often made them laugh, and they shared stories from their shared history. They especially cherished the time spent with their grandchildren. The children loved being with their grandparents, and Charles and Grace created an environment full of warmth and security for them. They played games, told fairy tales, and showed them the little wonders of the garden. These moments were a source of great joy and fulfillment for both. They loved cooking together and trying out new recipes. The kitchen became the heart of their home, where they laughed, experimented, and enjoyed the meals they had prepared together. It was not just the food, but the time they spent together that made these moments so special. Their deep bond and mutual support radiated to their entire surroundings. Friends and neighbors admired the harmony and happiness that Charles and Grace exuded. Their relationship was a shining example of how love and understanding could create a fulfilled life. In recent years, Charles began to change noticeably. His once calm and balanced nature increasingly gave way to a more irritable and distant demeanor. Grace noticed how her husband, who used to start every morning with a smile, now often sat at the breakfast table with a grumpy expression. Conversations that once flowed easily and joyfully became rarer and more strained. Charles, who had always been so patient and understanding, now quickly lost his temper over small matters. When working in the garden, he often threw his tools aside in frustration and muttered curses under his breath. Grace could sense that something was wrong, but tried to attribute his mood swings to aging and the associated stress. Evenings that they once spent harmoniously together were now dominated by a cold silence. Charles seemed lost in thought, often with a contemplative or even angry expression. Grace wondered if she had done something wrong, but whenever she brought it up, he would either evade the topic or become even more irritable. The walks they had loved so much became less frequent. Charles withdrew more and more, spending hours alone in his study, or leaving the house without telling Grace where he was going. She tried to understand him and give him space, hoping it was just a phase. Their friends and neighbors also noticed the change. During gatherings, Charles was often absent or reacted impatiently to questions and conversations. Grace struggled to maintain a facade, but inside she was deeply worried. She searched for explanations and tried to restore the old harmony, but it seemed as though something deeper and unspoken stood between them. Grace clung to the hope that everything would return to normal. She tried to be patient and supportive, but the feeling of helplessness gnawed at her. The distance between them grew, and Grace felt increasingly lonely in her concern for her beloved husband. One evening, when the tension between Charles and Grace was almost unbearable, Charles gathered all his courage and sat down with Grace in the living room. His face was serious, and his hands trembled slightly. Grace sensed that something significant was coming, something that would shake her world. "Grace," Charles began hesitantly, "we need to talk." Grace nodded, unable to ignore the cold knot forming in her stomach. She had no idea what was coming, but the gravity of his voice made her fear the worst. "There is someone," Charles continued, avoiding her gaze. "Someone I met, a young woman named Emily. She is 20 years old, and..." He swallowed hard. "I have fallen in love with her." The words hit Grace like a slap in the face. She could hardly breathe as she tried to grasp the meaning of what Charles was saying. What are you saying, Charles?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper. Charles finally looked at her, his eyes full of a mix of guilt and determination. "I can't go on like this. I have told Emily that I will divorce you. I want to spend my life with her." Grace felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. Everything they had built together over the past 50 years suddenly seemed meaningless. The memories, the love they had shared, all of it was wiped away in a single moment. Tears welled up in her eyes and she couldn't utter a word. Charles, sensing the depth of her despair, stood up and left the room, unable to bear her pain any longer. Grace was left alone, her world collapsing around her. The man she had loved her entire life had left her for a younger woman. The reality of this terrible truth was overwhelming. Grace sank onto the sofa, tears flowing uncontrollably. Her heart was broken, and she couldn't imagine how she would ever overcome this pain. The news of Charles's decision hit Grace like a massive storm. The days that followed blurred into a fog of pain and confusion. Grace could hardly believe that the life she had shared with Charles for over half a century was suddenly in ruins. The feelings of loneliness and betrayal weighed heavily on her, oppressive and omnipresent. Every corner of the house reminded her of their shared years. The empty bed beside her, the abandoned armchair in the living room, the silent dining table, all spoke of a time that now seemed irretrievably lost. Grace tried to manage her daily tasks, but every move, every action was accompanied by a sharp pain in her heart. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the many happy moments she had shared with Charles. The shared laughter, the familiar conversations, the quiet moments of closeness, all of it now seemed like a cruel illusion. Grace felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her feet. The man she had loved her entire life was no longer by her side, and the feeling of abandonment was unbearable. Grace withdrew more and more, unable to let the outside world share in her pain. Friends and family worried about her, but Grace couldn't accept their comfort. She felt trapped in a whirlwind of grief and despair, from which there seemed to be no escape. Every day was a struggle, every breath a reminder of the loss. Grace didn't know how to go on without Charles. Her heart was broken, and the scars left by this betrayal seemed incurable. The love she once felt for Charles was now overshadowed by a deep, all-consuming sorrow. Charles moved into a new, modern apartment with Emily in a lively part of the city. The apartment was stylishly furnished, with large windows that let in plenty of light, and an open floor plan that made it feel spacious and inviting. Charles hoped that this new environment would help him make a fresh start and leave his difficulties behind. At first, everything seemed perfect. Emily was full of energy and joy for life, and Charles enjoyed the new experiences and the changed dynamic in his life. They often went out, visited trendy restaurants, and attended cultural events. It was an exciting time that reminded Charles of what it was like to be young and enjoy life to the fullest. But soon, Charles realized that things were not as simple as he had imagined. The differences between him and Emily became increasingly apparent. While Charles valued peace and stability, Emily craved adventure and constant change. She wanted to travel, meet new people, and live life at a pace that became increasingly exhausting for Charles. The age difference also showed in their interests and conversations. While Charles enjoyed talking about history and literature, Emily was more interested in the latest trends and social media. He found it difficult to form a deeper connection with her, one like he had with Grace. The conversations often remained superficial and did not fulfill him in the same way as the profound discussions with his former wife. The initial euphoria gave way to a creeping dissatisfaction. Charles began to feel that something essential was missing. The ease he had enjoyed in the first weeks was replaced by an indefinite longing. The apartment, which had initially seemed so fresh and exciting, increasingly felt empty and impersonal. Financial worries added to the strain. The new life with Emily was expensive, and Charles found that his savings were dwindling faster than expected. Emily, accustomed to a carefree life, often did not understand his concerns, leading to tensions between them. Charles felt torn between the desire to make Emily happy and the reality that their lifestyles were hardly compatible. The initial enthusiasm gave way to the sobering realization that starting a new life was far more complicated and burdensome than he had ever imagined. Grace decided, despite her deep pain, to reshape her life. The void left by Charles made her realize that she needed to find something that brought her joy and fulfillment. She had always had a passion for art, but the demands of everyday life and her role as a wife and mother had kept her from pursuing this dream. One afternoon, while walking through the city, Grace noticed a sign advertising art classes at a local studio. On a whim, she decided to enroll. The first step into the studio felt like stepping into a new world. The smell of paint and canvas, the quiet murmur of other participants, and the inspiring atmosphere filled her with a sense of anticipation and excitement. In the following weeks, Grace immersed herself in art. She learned techniques of oil and watercolor painting, experimented with different styles, and let her creativity flow freely. Every brushstroke, every color she applied to the canvas helped her process a bit of her pain. Art became a valve through which she could express her emotions and heal her soul. During the classes, Grace also formed new friendships. The other participants were a diverse mix of ages and backgrounds, and she quickly found connections. She especially bonded with Helen, a warm-hearted woman her age, and Clara, a young, lively artist. The hours spent together in the studio, and the conversations over coffee afterward, became regular parts of her new daily life. Grace found comfort and support in these friendships. She realized that she was not alone, and that there were people who understood her and helped her look forward. Helen and Clara encouraged her to present her works in a small exhibition, which initially made Grace nervous, but also gave her a new sense of purpose and pride. The art classes and new friendships gave Grace the strength to reorganize her life and look to the future with hope. She began to feel that despite the deep pain Charles had caused her, she was capable of leading a fulfilling and happy life. Each day brought new challenges and joys, and slowly but surely, Grace found her way from darkness to light. Charles soon began to feel the challenges of his new life with Emily. The initial excitement and adventure of starting over quickly gave way to a sobering reality. The age difference between them, which had seemed insignificant at first, became an increasingly significant barrier. Emily was full of energy and had an insatiable curiosity about life. She often wanted to go out, try new restaurants, attend concerts, and spend long nights with friends. Charles, who preferred peace and stability, found it difficult to keep up with Emily's pace. Their differing life rhythms led to tensions and misunderstandings. Their expectations for the relationship were also different. The conversations they had often remained superficial, and Charles missed the profound discussions he once had with Grace. It seemed as though they had little in common beyond the initial attraction. Charles also realized that Emily was immature in many ways. Her reactions to conflicts were impulsive and emotional. often leading to heated arguments. She struggled to understand his needs and to take his perspective into account. Charles increasingly felt isolated and misunderstood in the relationship. The financial burden also grew. Emily's lifestyle was expensive, and Charles found that his savings were depleting faster than expected. This led to further tensions, as Emily was not willing to reduce her expenses. Charles began to worry about the future, and the feeling of insecurity gnawed at him. The romantic notion of a new life with Emily was replaced by the harsh reality that they were incompatible in many fundamental ways. Charles struggled with the realization that the decision to leave Grace might have been a grave mistake. The initial euphoria had faded, and he now faced the difficult task of finding a way to navigate this complicated relationship. Charles slowly began to realize that life with Emily was far from the fairy tale he had imagined. The initial excitement and sense of renewal quickly faded, and he was confronted with the harsh realities of their relationship. One evening, when Emily went out again, staying out late into the night, Charles sat alone in the living room of their modern apartment. The silence surrounding him amplified the feeling of emptiness growing inside him. He thought about the many evenings he had spent with Grace, listening to music, talking and laughing together. These memories now seemed like a distant dream, a dream he had carelessly given up. Charles began to miss the stability and comfort Grace had provided him. The daily rituals he had once taken for granted, having breakfast together, taking walks, engaging in simple conversations, he now sorely missed. He realized that these seemingly mundane moments were the foundations of a deep and fulfilling relationship. With Emily, he lacked this depth, this familiarity that he had shared with Grace. The challenges and conflicts he experienced with Emily only intensified his longing for what he had lost. He remembered how Grace had always been patient and understanding, how she had helped him through difficult times, and how she had always stood by his side no matter what. This unconditional love and support were absent with Emily. Charles felt increasingly torn. He had made a decision that had radically changed his life, and now he began to understand that he had made a grave mistake. The longing for his old life, for the stability and genuine deep connection he had shared with Grace, grew stronger every day. While Emily continued to live her life to the fullest, Charles withdrew more and more into himself. He spent hours reflecting on his decisions and considering the consequences. Reality had shattered his illusions, and he was forced to confront the bitter truth. Life with Emily could never be the fairy tale he had hoped for, and the price he had paid was immense. Grace often found herself deeply absorbed in her work, in the bright, spacious rooms of the art studio. The canvas before her was not just a medium for colors and shapes, but also a mirror of her soul. Every brushstroke, every shading, and every composition was an expression of her deepest emotions and thoughts. One day, while working on one of her pieces, the art teacher, Mr. Smith, approached her and looked at her painting. "This is impressive, Grace," he said softly. "Your ability to use light and shadow to evoke emotions is extraordinary. You should consider exhibiting your works." Surprised and pleased, Grace smiled shyly. The idea that her artworks could be seen and appreciated by others filled her with a mix of joy and nervousness. Grace took her teacher's advice and prepared for her first exhibition. The weeks of preparation were intense but fulfilling. She carefully selected her best works, framed them, and prepared small descriptions to hang beside the paintings. On the day of the exhibition, there was a buzz of excitement in the small but renowned art center in the city. As visitors arrived, Grace felt a wave of recognition and respect. People paused in front of her paintings, discussing the depth and expression of her works, and praising the sensitive way she handled her subjects. An elderly couple stood for a long time in front of one of her landscape paintings and spoke to her. "This picture reminds us of a place we visited many years ago," said the woman, tears in her eyes. "It's as if you captured our memories." Grace was deeply touched by such reactions. She felt that her art was not only a personal healing, but also had the power to touch and inspire others. This realization gave her deep satisfaction and a sense of purpose that she had not felt in a long time. Her exhibition was a great success. Several works were sold, and she received offers for further exhibitions in other galleries. But it was not just the financial success that fulfilled her. It was the knowledge that she had created something meaningful, that she was able to bring beauty and depth into the world. Grace also found great comfort in the friendships she made during this time. Helen and Clara became close confidants. They spent many evenings together, discussing art, life, and their personal experiences. These conversations were invaluable to Grace. They helped her organize her thoughts and find her new path in life. One evening, after a particularly inspiring day in the studio, Grace sat with Helen and Clara in a small cafe. The light of the setting sun bathed the room in a warm golden glow. They laughed and chatted, and Grace felt a deep gratitude for the new connections in her life. "You have helped me so much," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Helen took her hand and smiled. "We are friends, Grace, and we are glad to have you in our lives." Over time, Grace became increasingly known in the local art scene. She received invitations to art fairs and began leading workshops. Her self-confidence grew with every new challenge she mastered. She discovered a strength and resilience in herself that she had not known before. Grace also began presenting her works online, finding a wide audience there. The positive feedback and recognition she received boosted her self-esteem and encouraged her to be even bolder in her art. She experimented with new techniques and subjects, drawing inspiration from the small things of everyday life, and finding an inexhaustible source of joy and fulfillment in her art. Every day brought new opportunities and experiences. Grace felt alive and fulfilled. Her art was not only a valve for her emotions, but also a way to understand and appreciate the world around her. The recognition she received was the icing on the cake of a life she now led with self-determination and joy. Grace had found a new purpose in life, one that brought her deep satisfaction. The art, the friendships, and the successes she experienced helped her overcome the pains of the past and create a bright future. Charles faced a deep emotional and financial crisis. His savings had dwindled faster than he had expected, and the costly expenses he had indulged in with Emily began to take their toll. The financial burden weighed heavily on him, and he felt increasingly overwhelmed by the responsibility of providing for their life together. Every bill that arrived amplified his worries and fears. He spent sleepless nights thinking about his finances and wondering how he would cover the rising costs. The joy and excitement he had felt at the beginning of his new life with Emily had given way to a deep, gnawing uncertainty and regret. Emotional tensions further exacerbated the situation. Charles felt more and more estranged from Emily, whose carefree lifestyle now seemed superficial and incompatible with his own needs. Their conflicts became more frequent and intense, and he realized that he missed the stable, understanding relationship he had had with Grace. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with Emily, Charles sat exhausted on the sofa, staring into space. The loneliness and feeling of loss overwhelmed him. He thought of Grace, her patience, her wisdom, and the deep connection they had shared. The thought that he had given up this love and stability for a fleeting passion filled him with deep regret. Charles began to question his decisions and berate himself. The realization that he had lost everything that had once been important to him weighed heavily on him. He felt trapped in a life that was not what he had imagined, and the longing for what he had given up grew stronger. The financial strain and emotional dissatisfaction wore on his nerves. Charles knew he had made a wrong decision, and the realization hit him hard. The reality that he had lost Grace, a woman who had always stood by him and loved him unconditionally, brought him to the brink of despair. While Emily went out and enjoyed her life, Charles often sat alone at home, lost in thought and plagued by remorse. The memories of the years he had shared with Grace, which he had tried to suppress, now returned with an intensity that nearly overwhelmed him. He began to understand that what he had had with Grace was irreplaceable and precious, something he had carelessly given up in his quest for something new. Charles knew he needed to find a way to deal with his feelings and his situation, but the burden of regret and financial worries threatened to crush him. The crisis he faced was not just external, but also deeply internal, forcing him to confront his own mistakes and weaknesses. One cold winter evening, Charles decided to visit a small art exhibition at a local cultural center to distract himself from his thoughts. He entered the gallery and let his gaze wander over the works hanging on the walls. The vibrant colors and expressive forms immediately captivated him. As he stepped into the main room, he abruptly stopped. There, amidst a group of people, he saw Grace. She stood in front of one of her own paintings, talking to visitors, and radiating a calm and confidence that deeply impressed him. Her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm, and her smile was warm and inviting. Charles felt his heart race. He watched her from a distance, and couldn't help but remember all the years they had spent together. Grace had changed so much, yet she was still the same woman he had always loved. Her transformation from the woman so deeply hurt by his betrayal to this strong and independent artist was remarkable. He saw how visitors admired her work, listened to her explanations, and how Grace captivated them with each smile and word. Charles felt a mix of pride and deep regret. He knew that Grace had found a way not only to survive, but to thrive without him. Carefully, he approached the group and waited patiently until the visitors dispersed. When Grace finally noticed him, her eyes widened in surprise. A moment of silence ensued, during which they just looked at each other. Charles felt as though he were standing before a stranger, and yet the most familiar person in his life. "Grace," he finally said, his voice soft and full of emotion. "Your works are wonderful. I'm impressed by what you've achieved." Grace held his gaze and slowly nodded. "Thank you, Charles," she replied calmly. "It means a lot to me that you say that." The two stood there for a moment in silence, surrounded by Grace's paintings, which reflected her journey of healing and self-discovery. Charles could see the strength and determination in her eyes, and he felt the deep chasm that had opened between them. Nevertheless, he was grateful to share this moment with her, and he realized how much he missed and admired her. Grace, who had made her own journey, felt a mix of old and new emotions. She saw the man before her, who had once destroyed her world, and recognized that despite everything, she had moved on and found a new strength within herself. Charles gathered all his courage and stepped closer to Grace. His heart was pounding, and he felt his words catching in his throat. But he knew he had to say what had been weighing on him for a long time. "Grace," he began, his voice trembling, "I need to apologize. I made a terrible mistake and I regret it every day." Grace looked at him, her eyes cool and distant. She nodded slightly, signaling him to continue. Charles took a deep breath. "I threw away the life we built together carelessly. I hurt and disappointed you, and there is no excuse for that. I wanted to tell you that I am infinitely sorry." He felt the weight of each word as they came out, each carrying the burden of his regret. "I thought I could find something new, but all I realized was how valuable what we had was. You were always there for me, and I didn't appreciate that." Grace listened, but her thoughts seemed elsewhere. The wounds he had inflicted were deep, and while she heard his words, they did not truly touch her heart. Too much time had passed and too much had happened. Charles could see it in her eyes. The distance that had built up between them was not easily overcome. "Thank you for saying that, Charles," she finally replied, her voice calm and controlled. "But words cannot change the past. I have learned to move on without you, and I have found my own life." Charles nodded sadly. He had hoped that his apology might restore some of the old connection between them, but he now knew that was not possible. Grace had found her own path, and although he respected that, it pained him deeply to know that he was the one who had destroyed that bridge. Grace looked at Charles, her face showing a mix of thoughtfulness and determination. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Charles, I appreciate your apology. It means a lot to me that you recognize your mistakes and regret them." Her voice was calm but firm. "But the truth is, I'm not the same person I was when we were together." Charles felt a pang of regret as he saw the resolve in her eyes. Grace continued, "The past months have been a journey of self-discovery and healing for me. I've learned to stand on my own and found a new passion in art. This time has shown me that I am stronger than I ever thought." She paused and looked around the gallery, filled with her paintings and the people admiring them. "This new world I've built is my life now. It's filled with new friends, new experiences, and a sense of fulfillment I didn't know before." Grace's eyes met Charles's again. "I don't want to go back to the past," she said emphatically. "What we had is over, and I have accepted that it is part of my history. But I live in the here and now, and I am happy with what I have achieved." Charles felt the finality of her words. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a calm acceptance and a strong sense of self-determination. Grace had found her own identity and a new life, one that was independent of her past with him. "I wish you all the best, Charles," she added, "but I need to continue on my own path." With these words, she turned and joined a group of visitors, admiring one of her paintings. Charles stood there, overwhelmed by the clarity and determination Grace had shown. He knew he had lost her, but he also respected the strength and new life she had created for herself. Grace saw Charles a few weeks later during a chance encounter at a cafe. He looked exhausted and dejected, a shadow of his former self. She remembered the times she had stood by him, and although their romantic relationship was over, she still felt a deep sense of humanity and compassion for him. She approached him and sat down at his table. "Charles," she began gently, "I see that you're not doing well. Is there any way I can help?" Charles looked up, surprised and touched by her kindness. "Grace, I don't know what to say. I've messed everything up." Grace placed her hand reassuringly on his. "We all make mistakes, Charles. The important thing is how we learn from them and move forward." She spoke with a wisdom and calmness that deeply moved him. "I've made contacts in the art and cultural scene. Maybe I can help you find a new path, one that brings you joy and purpose again." Charles was initially skeptical, but Grace persisted. She helped him find a course in art therapy, something that gave him the opportunity to express and process his emotions through creative work. She used her connections to secure him a spot in one of these courses and introduced him to some of her new friends, who welcomed him warmly. Grace visited Charles regularly to ensure he was doing better. She encouraged him to talk about his feelings and supported him in rebuilding his life. Although they no longer had a romantic relationship, a new form of friendship developed between them, based on respect and understanding. "You have given me so much, Grace," Charles said one day, as they sat together in a park enjoying the fresh air. "I never thought you could be so generous after everything I did to you." Grace smiled gently. "Life is too short to hold grudges, Charles. We all deserve a second chance, and I see that you're ready to change and grow." This support helped Charles to reorganize his life. He began to develop new interests and found a vocation in art therapy that not only helped him advance his own healing, but also allowed him to help others in similar situations. Grace's act of generosity and her understanding of the complexity of life and forgiveness had given him the opportunity to get back on his feet and find new meaning in life. Grace and Charles went their separate ways after their encounter at the cafe, but there was a sense of peace between them. Grace continued to dedicate herself to her art and became increasingly recognized as a respected artist in the community. Her works told stories of pain, healing, and the power of the human spirit, inspiring many with her courage and determination. Charles, on the other hand, found not only a new calling in art therapy, but also a way to fight his own demons. He helped others process their traumas and found deep meaning and satisfaction in it. Grace's support and gesture of forgiveness had shown him that it was never too late to change and do something good in the world. One spring day, when the flowers were blooming and the birds were singing, Grace and Charles met by chance in a park. It was a warm moment of reunion, without resentment or bitterness, but full of appreciation for the journey each had taken. They sat on a bench and exchanged news, laughed, and reminisced about shared times. "It's nice to see how far we've come," Grace said, smiling at Charles. "We've both learned and grown." Charles nodded in agreement. "Yes, and I'm grateful for the second chance you gave me. You helped me believe in myself again." As they sat there enjoying the warm rays of the sun, it became clear to both of them that despite all the difficulties and pain, they had found a way to be happy. Their stories were intertwined, but they had learned to live and thrive independently of each other. Grace and Charles's paths might have been separate, but they had found peace in their hearts. The past was part of them, but they had learned to look forward and embrace life. Their story was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the ability to find new joy and fulfillment, even after the deepest traumas. Grace returned to her studio, ready to prepare for her next exhibition, while Charles planned new projects at his art therapy center. Both knew that life was not always easy, but they had found the strength to move forward and find their own form of happiness. The message of their journey was clear. No matter how difficult the times are, there is always the possibility to get up again and start a new chapter.